Can you hear those winds? It's howling out here just off the shores of the Hudson Bay. In fact, it's behind me where the ice is just starting to form. Polar bears are nearby, they're in the area. That's because today we're outside of Churchill, Manitoba. We're bringing you the Tundra Connections program live from Buggy One. My name's Kyle Schutt. I'm the partner on Polar Bears International's Tundra Connections program, and I'm coming to you from Discovery Education. Now let's take a little tour of Buggy One, why don't we? I mentioned this is kind of like a monster truck, right? Big wheels, big tires, they keep us safe from the bears, but there's a whole lot more going on. In fact, I'd like to introduce you to my friend here, KT, because KT has a really important job behind the scenes. As we go throughout the program, KT's taking all kinds of information, cameras from inside, cameras from, well, how you're recording me right now. In fact, even cameras that are mounted outside on Buggy One, and remixing that together to bring you shots of polar bears, images that hopefully get you engaged and wanting to learn more about polar bears. I mentioned this is a buggy after all, so we can't forget, here's the driver's seat, in case we need to get up and cruise around and look for some more bears. But we won't do that while we're talking with you this morning. In fact, before we get started and I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of what Buggy One looks like from the outside. That barren landscape is just remarkable. Take a look at the rocks, the snow, and that's just out the windows right here. So as we come back into Buggy One, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists, the guests on the show today who have such knowledge and so much great information to share with you, and frankly, to be able to answer your questions. So, Stephanie, can you start and say hello and tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. Excited to be here. My name's Stephanie Penk, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Toronto in Canada. And my research focuses on determining the energetics of polar bears. So what I mean by that is I'm trying to figure out how much energy polar bears get when they eat a meal and how much energy they need to survive life up here on the tundra, to run around up here, to get out onto the ice, and to reproduce and survive.
Thank you so much. And BJ, you're the man responsible for this engineering marvel called Buggy One, as far as making it able to bring the internet, bring the cameras, deliver all this content to the students in classrooms all around North America and beyond. So can you share a little bit about what it is you do with Polar Bears International and how you came to be doing this kind of work?
Sure. So I'm BJ Kirchhofer, and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. My job is really kind of split into two different parts. Part of the year I'm here in Churchill kind of helping talk about science with people like Steph and Kyle and broadcasting that out to students like yourselves. And then the other part of the year I get to work in the field with polar bears and biologists, trying to ask some of the questions about what's going on with polar bears.
Thank you so much. And so speaking of learning about polar bears, we want you to learn with us. Today our goal is to answer as many questions as we can. In fact, we have an entire follow-up to this virtual field trip that is dedicated only to Q&A. As we go throughout this show, please make sure that you do contact us, whether you're on social media. We love to see what your viewing party experience looks like. How are your students organized? Are you sitting around a screen? What is it like as you learn about polar bears? You can share with us using the hashtag Tundra Connections and hashtag CelebrateWithDE. And if you want to get our attention, of course, tag at Polar Bears and at Discovery Ed. You may also email questions to us. Questions@pbears.org is the email inbox. Again, that's questions@pbears.org. And then if you're watching this on the Tundra Connections viewing page, there's a little chat panel you can sign up for and interact. And we have moderators that are helping us, thanks to those folks that are helping answer all of the questions right now. So here's a little bit about the show. First off, we're going to try to stay warm. It's in Fahrenheit, -2, but it's working its way to -6. The wind chill temperature, which it's debatable, but it looked like about -22 in Fahrenheit, and we figured that was around, what was it, -33 Celsius?
33, 36, somewhere around
And the
there,
actual
yeah.
temperature was -22, did I have that right, Celsius, something like that?
Something like that.
I think we're around
-14.
minus.
Yeah.
It's a bit
Getting
chilly.
close to 20.
You'll see the buggy rocking because the winds are blowing. And we're going to take you out to learn all about polar bears. In fact, we're going to start with a video about a polar bear named Ursula. We're going to come back, answer as many questions as possible, and then learn more about animal adaptations. And finally, we'll recap the show with what you can do and solutions that we can work together to try to support polar bears and learn about this Arctic and subarctic ecosystem. So, As we get started, don't forget to submit those questions, but let's just take a moment and really learn about a special polar bear named Ursula.
Polar bears are a mighty creature with a fragile future. It's amazing that they can survive, and in fact thrive, in an environment as cold and harsh as the Arctic. My name is Elisa McCall. I'm a polar bear scientist. I've studied a lot of bears over the years, but there's one that sticks out in my mind. Her research number is X33410, but we know her more fondly as Ursula. We first met Ursula in September of 2015 along the coast of Hudson Bay. At the time, she was a beautiful 8-year-old mother accompanied by a healthy yearling cub. It would be nearly impossible to follow a single polar bear around for an entire year in the remote Arctic, but through decades of research, we have been able to piece together the puzzle of what Ursula and other polar bears experience throughout their life. In this region of the subarctic, sea ice forms in the fall, covers the bay through the winter and spring, and melts completely in the summer months. Given that polar bears need sea ice as a platform to travel on and hunt seals, the summer melt forces polar bears to fast on land with little to no food for multiple months. As it became colder and ice slowly started forming along the coast, Ursula and her cub headed north. A GPS collar allowed us to closely follow their movements. Ice formation in 2015 was particularly late, and it wasn't until the end of November that the ice was finally strong enough for Ursula to head out onto Hudson Bay with her growing cub. As I watched Ursula's track moving across the map, I thought about the challenges she was facing. Frigid temperatures, complete darkness, dodging aggressive males, sniffing out seals, all with the sea ice moving and drifting beneath her feet. In the spring, it was time for Ursula to wish her now 2.5-year-old cub good luck and send him off on his own. I hoped she would successfully mate again and perhaps be able to raise another generation of cubs. In June, Ursula traveled farther out onto Hudson Bay. She was no doubt hunting seals and trying to fatten up before the sea ice started to break apart. Each year, Ursula's world literally dissolves in the summer heat. Shortly after that, Ursula's collar went offline. This probably meant that she was swimming back to shore, because the collar doesn't have a signal when it's in the water. So I was relieved to see her collar pop back online east of the town of Churchill, Manitoba in early August. She continued her journey inland toward a denning area, and scientists spotted a fabulously fat Ursula in the final days of September. Shortly after that, her collar signal stopped moving, and I crossed my fingers that she might have entered a den. Around Christmas, she did indeed give birth to at least 2 cubs. In March, she and her cubs emerged from the den. I couldn't help but feel excited at the thought of those adorable little polar bears exploring the world for the very first time. Ursula had not had a proper meal for nearly 8 months. Now that her cubs were ready, they began their journey to the sea ice to hunt seals, and we can be sure they were hungry. Shortly before making it out on the ice, scientists once again spotted Ursula, confirming that she had 2 young cubs in tow. I was thrilled when I got the news. Protecting, feeding, and teaching young cubs how to survive on a moving platform of ice is no small feat, but these are critical lessons for a polar bear and vital to the survival of the species. In July, Ursula's collar went offline. The last known location was out on the sea ice in the middle of Hudson Bay. The normal challenges Ursula faces are great, but in a warming world, the challenges polar bears face are immense. In September of 2017, scientists found Ursula's collar on land. She made it back. Whether her cubs made it with her or not, we may never know. If they did, were they able to survive the long fall without food? And then another? More than that, I wonder if they realize their world is melting away. Ursula and her cubs have to wait on land an average of 1 day longer every year. They have to survive a month longer on land without food than their grandparents did. And Ursula's cubs face an even longer fast unless we bring a halt to rising carbon emissions. If the world continues to warm, Ursula's cubs will face challenges they won't be able to overcome. But it's not all hopeless, and there is good news. We can choose to act now to halt climate change and make a swift transition to renewable energy. Ursula was still able to give birth and raise multiple generations of cubs. Polar bears still thrive over much of their current range, and we have the knowledge and tools to halt climate change in time to keep it that way. We stopped acid rain, we saved the ozone, we can save polar bears. If we do, we will not only help Ursula, but all life on Earth, including ourselves.
Understanding just what Ursula went through and really thinking about that story, it opens up our eyes to the ecosystem that the bears live in, to how they survive, to what they eat, to even their adaptations, which we will get to in just a couple minutes here. And we wish we could show you a bear just outside this window, but it is so blowing. In fact, I learned a little bit of what this terminology for this weather is called. BJ was sharing with me earlier. Can you talk a little bit about the ground storm that's happening? Because as we look up into the sky, you can see the sun.
Yeah, it's kind of a neat phenomenon that happens here in the Arctic from time to time. It's not really snowing out, or it doesn't appear to be snowing, but there's so much wind it's picking up anything that can blow around out here on the landscape. And so we can't really see that far horizontally. But if you look straight up, you can still see the blue sky from time to time. So it's kind of a neat little ground blizzard that's happening here. I've seen it after dark where the northern lights were raging overhead, but you couldn't see the snowmobile hardly in front of you.
Wow. And of course, for the bears, what that means, they're either waiting and they're hiding in the willows, or they're out there on the ice. In fact, if you want to know a little bit about the ice formation, you can do that. Take a look at the Canadian Ice Service. If you research that, you'll find that on the internet, and it's pretty fascinating to see the growth day over day, and that's happening right now. What we were able to do, though, is we were able to shoot a really, we were able to capture a really adorable bear the other day on our way out here, and I thought we might pull it up because it's also a good example of how bears they just burrow themselves in the willows there, right? Isn't that pretty neat, just watching that bear? And this is what they're doing, and so they're hunkered down with this wind, they're curled up in a ball, they're even tough to spot. But when it breaks up and it's sunny like that, it's pretty neat. So while you're watching that, I did want to give just a couple shout outs. There's so many classrooms joining us. Hello, I know we have Scurry Schools, Bear Creek Elementary watching, Miss Heydrich, Miss Sahota, Miss Russo's class. Thank you for joining us. I'm seeing pictures and photos all across the internet. This is great. Right from Twitter, using Tundra Connections and Celebrate with DE, the 5th grade class from Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us. That's wonderful. We love to have you. We have Riddlebrook School that's joining us. Thank you so much. Miss Frank, so many questions coming in from Huntington Beach, California. They wrote all their questions on a whiteboard. I thought that was really clever. In fact, maybe something you can do to follow up the broadcast as you
Really
want
cool.
to find out how you explore more, right? Miss Tisdale's class, thank you so much for joining us. Miss Gavapel's class, all these photos are amazing. In fact, Miss Bates students even dressed up like polar bears.
Oh,
Take a
that's
look
incredible.
at that.
That's
They're
awesome.
dressed up like polar bears
Love it.
there. Isn't that pretty neat? So we hope
Yeah.
you'll take a look and interact, because that's exactly the power of these Tundra Connections. We view them as shared learning experiences where you're learning with a whole bunch of other students. So let's go ahead and take a couple questions, because there's so many rolling in here. I thought we might start with one of our video questions that was submitted to us. And this question came from Ben in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Hi, I'm Benjamin from Adwood Primary School. I was wondering, do polar bears see in color or not? Hi, I'm Benjamin from Adwood.
All right, so Ben wanted to know, do polar bears see in color?
Yeah, well, we actually have now discovered that bears have dichromatic color vision. So that means that they have two cones in their eyes, and that allows them to see two different wavelengths. So that's two different distinct colors. And that is one less cone than you have at home. So you have a red, a green, and a blue, and polar bears just have yellow and blue. So they are able to see color, but the other thing about polar bears is that they're not just using their eyes, right? We have here the polar bear skull, and you can see this big area, and that is his nose. And there's so much surface area in there, and it allows bears to smell kilometers or miles away. So even though they do have color vision and do have some ability to see in the night, they're really following their nose more so than their eyes.
It's pretty fascinating. Thank you again. We're just a couple shout outs here. We have students of the Bulldogs in Missouri that are watching. Thank you so much. We've got first graders in Virginia Beach. Virginia Beach, hello. Thank you so much. Places that are connecting from far and wide. So let's just answer a couple more questions here. What about polar bears? Cromie Elementary in Michigan wants to know, do they ever travel in groups?
That's kind of a good question. I think that's probably one of the easiest ways to tell the difference between male and female polar bears. Probably if you see a group of bears, especially if it's one larger bear and a couple single or a couple smaller bears, it's probably a family group. And so it's probably a mom and cub or mom and two cubs. It does get a little bit confusing as those cubs get older. As they approach 2 years, if it's a male cub, it could be almost as big as mom. So it almost looks like a pack of bears hanging out. But otherwise, we don't think they spend a ton of time in groups traveling. Here in the coast of Hudson Bay, where they're waiting for the sea ice to freeze, they might gather up on the beach and kind of wait. But there isn't like large packs of polar bears roaming the sea ice looking for seals to eat.
Yeah, circumstantial for sure.
Yeah.
As to why they're together. Okay. Well, speaking of traveling, we had another video question that I wanted to bring up. And this question came from Santa Rosa County in Florida. So thank you, students, for joining us and for watching. And it's from Olivia. Let's go ahead and listen to Olivia's question.
Hi, I'm Olivia, a second grade student from Santa Rosa County in Pace, Florida. My question is, how far can polar bears travel? Hi, I'm Olivia, a second...
That's a good
I
question.
hope you heard that one. It was how far can polar bears travel?
Yeah.
Steph?
So polar bears can actually travel large distances. Now, their whole job while they're out there on the ice is to find seals. So the length of their travel really depends on where the seals are, and if they're able to find them close, then they won't travel too far. But they can go upwards of 850 kilometers or 550 miles over the course of the year trying to track those seals down. So to give you some perspective, that's about the distance from New York City to Detroit, or longer than Florida. So if you started at the bottom of Florida, you would hit Georgia before polar bears were done their yearly walk. And now that depends, the amount of movement they do really depends on the season as well. So during the summertime, with these western Hudson Bay bears, they're not doing much moving at all. And their most travel time comes during the freeze-up period, which is happening right now. And they're out there on the ice getting ready to find the seals. And speaking of ice, we did have an interesting analogy. We also have to think about ice is moving constantly. So when polar bears are trying to get from point A to point B, they might be walking against that ice, so they're almost fighting a treadmill to try and get where they need to go.
That's pretty amazing to think about. I mean, it's kind of, you say, it's an uphill journey,
Yes.
you know, figuratively, of course, but I mean, that's a lot of things against them, let's just say.
Definitely.
So, wow. Well, speaking of the ways that polar bears are adapted, let's take a moment and just learn about those adaptations and why they're uniquely suited to live in this environment.
Polar bears live across the Arctic in some of the coldest places on the planet. They walk across the Arctic sea ice looking for their main prey, seals. And they have some traits that help them do this and survive in this crazy cold environment. Polar bears have very thick fur that helps keep them warm. In fact, they have 2 layers of fur. They have a thick, fuzzy, downy layer right next to their skin, which would be like us wearing a woolly sweater. And then they have a layer of guard hairs, longer hairs over top. It's kind of like their raincoat. And these 2 layers of fur help keep them warm even when it's minus 40 degrees. Polar bear hair is clear and hollow. It just looks white to our eyes. And the hollowness helps trap warm air against their bodies. Polar bear skin is black. We don't really know why, but we think it might help them absorb heat. Polar bears have an amazing sense of smell. Their nose has so much surface area to pick up scents in the air. They can smell prey over a kilometer away when the wind is right. Polar bears have huge paws. They can be the size of dinner plates. The big paws help spread out the polar bear's weight on the sea ice so they can walk along really thin ice if they have to. Polar bear feet can also get smelly. When females are ready to mate, they send out signals through smelly footprints on the sea ice. And a male polar bear who picks up the scent will follow a female, sometimes for days on end. Polar bear paws are also kind of sticky. They have bumps or papillae on the bottom of their feet that help grip the ice as they're walking, kind of like your winter tires. They also have fur on their feet to help keep them warm and really sharp claws that help give them traction on the ice so they don't slip. Polar bear claws are thick and sharp. Their claws help them pull out slippery seals from underneath the water up onto the sea ice. Polar bears also have very big heads with really sharp teeth that helps them hunt their prey seals. You can see they've got big canines at the front, and then they've got very sharp back molars that help them shear blubber and fat off of their prey. The diastema, or the gap between the front sharp canines and the back molars, is perfect for helping polar bears grab a seal out of the water and pull it out onto the sea ice. You can see that all of these adaptations make a polar bear perfectly suited to live in the Arctic. They need sea ice to travel, hunt, find mates, and sometimes to den. Please join us in taking action to help conserve polar bears and the sea ice they depend on.
There's so much information there and so many interesting facts that I learned. I love learning about the thick fur, about the 2 different types of fur that they have, how their nose can just smell from such long distance. My favorite fact there, if I had to be honest, is that the polar bears themselves, they can send smells out through their paws. I mean, I never knew that. That was just fascinating to me. And I would love to know, what's that fact that you just learned that's so fascinating to you? Go ahead and put that out there on Twitter. Use hashtag ThunderConnections and celebrate with DE. We'd love to see, what is it that captured your attention, classes? What is it that just went, ooh, wow, I didn't realize that. And we'll follow up. We can't wait to see what you post there. Yeah. So let's go ahead and get to more questions. There's so many rolling in here. We're watching these videos and also smiling at just the photos and the pictures and all the students watching. So let's ask a couple of them. We have lots of questions about the kind of the ecosystem and the sea ice as well. Can you just talk about that ice and how do the bears know specifically when it's safe to walk on? Anything about the ice that you can share, Steph?
Yeah. So We obviously have been talking a lot about how polar bears need sea ice to find their food source, seals. So they also need it to leave those smelly footprints on so that they can track down each other to mate. And they need it to move around. So very important for polar bears. But sometimes what we don't think about is how important the Arctic sea ice is for all the other creatures in that marine ecosystem. So when sea ice freezes, it pushes the salt out of the ice, and that leaves little channels in this ice that allows room for algae to grow. And this algae supports the whole ecosystem. So we have little invertebrate creatures that'll eat the algae, and then the fish will eat the invertebrates, and then those seals eat the fish, and that supports the seal population for our polar bears to eat. So really, really important sea ice, not just for polar bears, but for everything out here on the Arctic sea ice.
You just answered a whole bunch of questions. Central Elementary, they sent in a bunch of questions. They were wondering how many seals a polar bear eats a day.
Okay, yeah.
Boy, they would love one a day, I think.
They would, I think so. They're gluttons, that's for sure. Now, they don't really eat the same amount a day. They're not like us. It's not 3 meals a day every day. They have what's called a feast and famine lifestyle. So when they have access to those seals, they try and get as many as they can. And when they catch a seal, they sit down and they eat 100 pounds of blubber just at one sitting. So very different. But they have to make sure they put on enough fat stores so that when they no longer have access to those seals, they can survive just using their fat stores, and they don't eat anything for upwards of 8 months for some female polar bears that give birth.
Wow, incredible. And that answers Miss Thomas's class. Thank you for submitting your question. In fact, thank you to Miss Michelle's class from Winnipeg. Not too far away. We're so glad that you're with us, that you're learning today. Excellent, excellent. In fact, Miss Reimer's class, wow, what a viewing party. So many students there in the library.
Oh,
they're
wow.
just packed in there.
That's
Super
great.
Thank you
cool.
for joining. That is really cool. So a couple more questions here. Specifically, there's a lot of questions about how you find out what the bears are doing, how you track them, how you understand them, and perform research.
I think this might be a good one for BJ.
Yes, I think that's been a big challenge. Up until this point, a lot of what we know about polar bears comes from radio collars. So maybe you've seen photographs of other animals or polar bears wearing a collar. For polar bears, female polar bears can only wear collars. The males kind of have a really thick neck and a smaller head, and those collars can fall right off. So the females wear the collars, and so we know a lot about where females go because we can find their locations through the satellite and kind of how they move and use that landscape. But it hasn't been real fine-scaled information throughout the whole history of collaring. Recently, they've put almost like Fitbit for polar bears inside some of these collars. They call them accelerometers inside these collars. And we're able to now start taking that information and kind of correlating it back to behavior. So are they swimming? Are they running? Are they walking? That sort of thing. So we can kind of understand. But this is still relatively new as far as polar bear research is concerned.
Very new.
Back to the adaptations topic, we had a video question that was submitted, a middle school. In fact, this is Lily from Eastbrook Middle School in Georgia. So hi Lily, thank you for joining us and watching. Let's go ahead and listen to her question.
Hi, my name is Lily. I'm in 7th grade Eastbrook Middle School in Dalton, and my question is it possible for polar bears to adapt to the changing climate before they go extinct?
So the question there again is it possible for polar bears to adapt to a changing climate before they go extinct?
Right.
You know, go ahead. It looks like you were jumping on that one.
I'll do my little piece, and then we'll go over to BJ here too. But I think it's interesting if we look back in history. We know that there was a period where glaciers extended a lot further south, and you can actually find evidence that polar bears were actually living further south when that ice was existing down there. But when those glaciers receded back north, the polar bears went with them. So if we take a lesson from history, it doesn't seem that the polar bears will be able to adapt if there is no ice for them to follow.
Yeah, and I think I would add that, it took, there's some debate, but around 800,000 years for polar bears to evolve from a grizzly bear. They're still so
Right.
closely related. These two animals are still closely related. They can still interbreed and create viable offspring. So they're pretty close cousins, if you will, you know? But you can't take a polar bear and move it back on land and expect it to, you know, turn into a grizzly bear again in a matter of, you know, decades or 100 years or something like that. And you wouldn't have a polar bear anyways. You wouldn't have a marine mammal. You'd have a terrestrial bear again.
Right.
Also, polar bears are huge. We'll probably talk about that here. And the bears that live on land here in the Hudson Bay region, they're quite small. And it's because their food isn't quite as fatty or nutritious to grow such a huge animal. So it's not possible.
Let's take a look. I think the other thing that question does is it really hones in on that idea of becoming extinct, and will they, or are there things that we can do? So let's take a look and learn just a little bit more about fossil fuels and the impact that carbon dioxide and other fossil fuels are having on our environment.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.
I love that idea, the idea right there at the end, the hope, right? There is absolutely still hope. We can absolutely work together here. But we're getting a lot of questions in, and specifically, again, our friends over in Vancouver, hello, thank you to Surrey Schools for joining us. They wanted to know, what can students today do to combat climate change and preserve polar bear habitats? BJ, you've done a lot of work here, and you've seen their habitat and seen the changes being out in the field so often. Can you respond to that one?
Sure. I think it's a pretty interesting conservation problem that we have with polar bears. It's not like the historic problem where an animal's habitat is disappearing, so you can build a fence around it and keep people out and everybody's safe. The bears are safe or whatever. The sea ice is melting, and you can't put a fence around melting sea ice. You guys, in fact, at home, learning about polar bears right now and engaging in this webcast, you're taking the first step in helping polar bears. The next step is really talking to the people around you, talking to your parents, your families, about what you learned here, about ways that you can reduce your climate emissions in your own homes and in your lives. And that's really super important, and believe it or not, that will help polar bears.
Excellent. Hi to the students in Newburgh, New York, by the way. So many of you sharing your photos and joining in, really appreciate that. We're getting a lot of other questions about just what can you do, right? I think personally, this is the start. We hope that you'll continue to extend your learning journey. But we also got a question from Michael, and Michael is from Troy High School in Fullerton, California. So Michael, thank you for joining in. Thank you for listening. Let's go ahead and tune into his question.
How did you start studying polar bears?
So, Steph, perhaps we can start with you. How did you start studying polar bears, and was it a lifelong dream to study polar bears from when you were little?
Yeah, so I took a bit of a windy path, but I always knew that I loved wildlife. So when I graduated from high school, I pursued my degree, my undergraduate degree, in wildlife biology. So I didn't know exactly where I was going with that, but I knew I wanted to have the knowledge to get involved with the environment and wildlife. So I actually took my first job studying bats, and they might be way, way smaller than bears, but the bats that I studied actually kind of face a similar challenge. They go into caves and hibernate, or go into a small hibernation. It's called torpor. But they need to make sure that they have enough fat stores on them so that they can survive overwintering in those caves without eating. So although we're talking about grams of fat on bats, and on polar bears we're talking about kilograms, which is about 1,000 times as large, it's a similar problem of this energetics. So after I finished up doing some presence-absence surveys, endangered species surveys with bats, I found a position to go back to school, so graduate school. I'm pursuing my doctorate, and this research project was focused on energetics in polar bears. And so I was able to kind of apply what I'd learned with bats and with that previous degree to this new project. And it's been a really amazing experience, and definitely makes me feel pretty good to be able to turn my passion into my work.
Excellent. And of course, those of you that want to study science, we encourage you to do so. We also realize that not everyone will go and do that. And BJ, I think your story is an interesting path to say, hey, you never know where you'll end up if you follow your passion. So can you speak a little bit about your past?
Sure. So I always enjoyed being outside when I was young, and ended up going to school in Montana because it offered those opportunities. I studied photography and media arts there, and that brought me up to Churchill here to help put on this program and run the streaming cameras. Through that, I was able to meet the scientists going out in the field, and I was asked to join them on a couple different projects, and that's really how I got into polar bears, more from kind of a hands-on perspective and learning to communicate and share that about the bears.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you to all of you that are watching. Miss Sanders' second grade library class tuning in and joining us. Miss Keller's class, Parkview Elementary is with us. Thank you. Mrs. White's second and third grade class participating. Thank you so much. There's just so many photos, so many questions here. We can't get to them all. We absolutely wish that we could. It's just not possible. But the good news there is that we have a follow-up event. Right after this, in about 45 minutes or so, we have an event, just Q&A. No, videos or anything. It's just you guys ask us questions, and we will answer as many as we can. So we'll hope that you'll use this event today, use that event in a little bit, to continue to learn about polar bears. I would finish by saying, it's my hope that the classes, the students that are tuning in, just use this as that first step. You're just getting started. What else can you do? Think about that. Maybe you can't vote, but your parents can vote. But what you can do is you can vote with your actions, right? The little things that you do, the choices you make every day, even in your home communities, do have a greater impact. So we hope that you'll continue to engage in this such important topic, and you'll continue to take those steps. If you want to continue to learn more, of course, Polar Bears International is chock full with resources. We hope that you'll continue to explore there. Those of you joining us from Discovery Education, we have a whole lot of resources. Can't wait to see what you come up with. Lots of your teachers post your 6-word stories and those follow-up strategies that you use for engaging and using digital content. We hope that you'll continue to share what it is you're learning about. But we can't thank you enough for just wanting to be here, wanting to learn with us. We're going to go warm up a little bit, I think. This wind is blowing us around a little bit. But it's just been a phenomenal webcast, and thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.